The morning my wife threw me out, a convoy of 10 black SUVs was already turning onto our street. The door closed behind me on a Tuesday morning in August, and I stood in that driveway with 2 suitcases and a guitar case while the Texas heat came up off the concrete like something alive. She had made up her mind. I had known it for a while. And if I'm being honest with you, I had made up mine too, just about different things. What she did not know, standing on the other side of that door with her sister and her certainty, was that in 4 hours I was going to sign my name to something worth $61 million. And what nobody on that quiet cul-de-sac in Sugarland could have known. Not the neighbors, not her sister, not the woman I had shared a bed with for 14 years, was that the guitar case sitting at my feet contained the original deed to a piece of land my grandfather purchased in 3rd Ward, Houston, in 1951, when black men in this city had to hide what they owned just to keep it. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is a story about money, about a man who had something his wife didn't know about, and what happened when she found out. Stay with me, because this was never about the money. The money was just the language my grandfather used to say something he never had words for, and I had spent 48 years learning to speak it. The first truck turned onto our street at 10:11 in the morning. She had already closed the blinds. The heat was already serious at that hour. And not the kind that builds across a day and peaks in the afternoon. The kind that arrives fully formed, like it has somewhere to be. The concrete of our driveway held it from the day before, and I could feel it coming up through the soles of my shoes while I stood there deciding which of the 2 suitcases I was going to carry first. I had packed them myself, which I mention only because Carla had offered, and I had declined. There was something important about doing that part myself. Folding my own shirts. Choosing what came with me and what stayed. When a chapter is closing, a man ought to close it with his own hands. The door behind me was shut, not slammed. She was too composed for that. And I had always known that about her, even on a morning like this one. The conversation through the cracked door had lasted 4 minutes. I had counted, not because I was timing it, but because my mind does that when the rest of me is very still. She told me her mother was coming for dinner, and she would prefer I not be there when that happened. She said it the way she might reschedule a contractor. Her voice was level. Her mind was made up. Behind her, 3 feet back and slightly to the left, Yolanda stood with her arms crossed and her eyes aimed somewhere past my shoulder, at a point in the middle distance that required no acknowledgement of me. I did not argue. I want to be clear about that. Not as a point of pride, but because it matters to what happened next. I did not argue because I had run out of things to say that I hadn't already not said for 9 years, and starting at that particular moment, on that particular morning, it felt like arriving to a fire with a glass of water. So I said, okay. I said I hoped dinner went well. And I meant it. The door closed, and I was in the driveway, and the August heat was holding me like it had an opinion. I set the guitar case down first, then the 2 suitcases, one on each side of me. A neighbor's sprinkler system clicked on 2 houses down, throwing a thin arc of water across a lawn that was fighting the summer and losing. Somewhere behind a fence, a dog decided something was worth barking at. Normal Tuesday morning sounds. The kind of sounds a neighborhood makes when it is not paying attention to you. I was not thinking about Carla. I want to say that plainly. I was not standing there running her decision back through my mind, looking for the moment where things could have gone differently. And that particular exercise had already lived its full life in me, in the dark, over the past several months, and I had nothing left to discover inside it. What I was thinking about was a man named Solomon Grimes, who had stood on harder ground than this, on mornings with more at stake than this, and had not flinched. I was thinking about something he told me when I was 17 years old. He said, "The ground beneath your feet does not care how loud you are." I looked down at the guitar case. That's when I heard it. The sound before the sight. A low, even hum of engines, the kind that comes from vehicles that have been well maintained and are in no particular hurry. I looked up toward the entrance of Whitmore Court, where our cul-de-sac opens onto the main road, and I watched the first black Suburban make the turn. Then the second. By the third, I understood what I was looking at. They moved the way official things move, not fast, not slow, with the particular authority of a procession that knows it doesn't need to announce itself. The lead vehicle had a small embossed seal on the rear window that I recognized because I had been looking at it on letterhead for the better part of 9 years. It belonged to Clifton Barnes, attorney at law of the Barnes and Collier firm on Greenway Plaza, 14th floor. 10 vehicles in total. I counted. My chest did something then. Not quite what you'd call relief, not quite what you'd call grief, but something in the space between the two that doesn't have a name I know. It felt like a long breath finally finishing. I picked up the guitar case. I left the suitcases exactly where they were, at one on each side of the space where I had been standing, like parentheses around a sentence that had already been completed. I would have someone collect them later. It didn't feel like the right morning to worry about luggage. The lead Suburban stopped 12 feet in front of me. The rear window came down, and I could see Clifton in the back seat, silver at the temples, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, looking at me over a manila folder the way he had looked at me across conference tables for nearly a decade. Patient, unhurried, certain. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just tilted his head toward the door. I looked back at the house one time. The blinds in the front window were closed. I don't know if she closed them before or after the trucks arrived. And I have thought about that question more than I expected to. Either way, she didn't see what was on that street. She had already turned away. I opened the rear door and got in, the guitar case across my knees, and the Suburban pulled forward, and the other 9 followed, and we moved out of that cul-de-sac the same way we had entered it, quietly and with somewhere definite to go. If you're still with me right now, go ahead and subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because this story is just getting started, and where we're going next is where everything begins. To understand what was in that case, you have to understand where Theo Grimes came from. Solomon Grimes was born in Beaumont, Texas, in 1921, and he arrived in Houston, the way most men of his generation arrived in cities, with nothing in his pockets and a complete understanding of what nothing felt like, so that he would recognize something when he finally held it. He worked the railroad first, the Southern Pacific Line out of Houston's Union Station, carrying luggage and linens and the particular invisible weight of being a black man in a white space where your only protection was your usefulness. He did that for 11 years. He learned in those 11 years how to read a room without appearing to look at it, how to absorb information from a conversation he was not invited to join, how wealthy men talked about land, casually, the way you talk about something you assume everyone has access to. He learned that they were wrong about that assumption, and he filed the correction away. In 1958, Solomon left the railroad and took a position as a maintenance foreman at the Jefferson Davis Hospital on Elder Street, which was the hospital that served Houston's black community in those years. He held that position for 22 years. He was not a man who required his work to announce him. He showed up before the building opened and left after it closed, and he did not discuss his salary with anyone, including my grandmother. What he did discuss, in the specific and deliberate way of a man who had made a private decision about where his energy was going, was land. He bought the first parcel in 1958, the same year he started at Jefferson Davis. It was a narrow lot on Holman Street in 3rd Ward, 4,200 square feet, a mostly gravel and one oak tree that had no business surviving there but did anyway. He paid $800 for it. He did not title it in his own name. He put it in the name of his sister, Beatrice Grimes, who lived in Galveston, and trusted Solomon absolutely because he had never given her a reason not to. The reason he didn't use his own name was not complicated. He had tried to purchase a different parcel 6 months earlier under his own name, and he had been told the property was no longer available. It had been available the previous afternoon, when a man whose name was not Solomon Grimes had inquired about it. Solomon was a precise man. He understood what the data was telling him. So Beatrice's name went on the Holman Street deed, and then a lot on Dowling Street went into the name of his cousin, Raymond Earl Grimes, and a double lot on Ennis Street in 1963 went into the name of his wife's brother, a man named Curtis Webb, who lived in Acres Homes and could be trusted to hold a piece of paper for as long as Solomon needed him to. By 1971, Solomon had accumulated 9 parcels across a 12-block radius of 3rd Ward, and not one of them was titled in his own name. If you looked for Solomon Grimes in the Harris County property records, you would find nothing. That was the point. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A man spending 20 years building something that, by design, would not show up next to his name. The discipline that requires, the patience, the absolute certainty that the work is the thing, not the credit. That philosophy had a cost, as most philosophies do. My father, Emmett Grimes, knew about the parcels. Solomon told him when my father turned 30, the same way Solomon told me when I turned 17. At the kitchen table on Tuam Street, with the shoebox of documents open between them and the overhead light making everything look more serious than it already was. The difference between my father and me was not intelligence. My father was a sharp man. The difference was that my father heard Solomon's philosophy and received the pride of it without fully absorbing the discipline underneath. By 1991, my father had let 2 of the parcels go to Harris County for unpaid property taxes. The Dowling Street lot first, $1,340 in back taxes, which my father did not have in February and intended to have by April, and did not have by April either. The Ennis Street double lot, 18 months later, the same way, the same sequence of intentions that ran slightly behind the calendar until the calendar won. I was 14 when the Dowling Street lot went. I did not understand fully what had happened, only that my father came home one evening and sat in the kitchen for a long time without eating, and my mother left him alone in a way that told me she already knew. Solomon was still alive then. He did not come to the house that week. When he finally came, 2 Sundays later, he and my father talked in the backyard for 40 minutes while I watched from the kitchen window. When they came in, my grandfather washed his hands at the kitchen sink, with the methodical attention of a man washing off something that wasn't going to come off entirely, and he did not speak again until dinner was on the table. He died in the spring of 1994. I was 19. He left me his guitar, a 1962 Harmony Sovereign, tobacco sunburst finish, that he had played at his church on Blodgett Avenue for 30 years, and a shoebox that contained the remaining deeds, the parcel survey maps, a list of the names each property was titled under, and a single index card in his handwriting that said, "Finish what I started. Don't talk about it. Just finish it." I sat in my childhood bedroom that night with the shoebox open on my bed, and I made a promise to a man who was no longer in a position to hear it. Then I put the documents inside the guitar case, latched it closed, and slid it under the bed. That was the same guitar case sitting beside me in the back of Clifton Barnes's Suburban, 29 years later, when we turned off I-59 toward downtown Houston on a Tuesday morning in August. Some things you carry a long time before you can set them down. I met Carla Watford in the spring of 2005. I was 34 years old, and for the first time in a long time, I thought I might have found someone worth telling the whole truth to. That feeling, and what I did with it, is where the real story begins. We were good together, in the beginning. I want to say that clearly, because the story of how a marriage ends can make you forget that it also began, and that the beginning was real. Carla Watford walked into a faculty reception at Texas Southern in March of 2005, wearing a green dress and the particular posture of a woman who has learned to enter rooms without waiting for them to welcome her. She was there with a friend from her pharmaceutical sales team, a woman named Keisha, who knew someone in the music department. I was there because the music department was where I spent most of my working hours. We were introduced near the food table, over a platter of cold shrimp that nobody was eating, and she shook my hand the way you shake hands with someone you're actually paying attention to, firm, brief, eyes steady. She asked what I taught. I told her. She asked if I played. I said some. And she said she had always wanted to learn piano, but had never had the patience for scales. I told her scales were just the language. The conversation came later. She looked at me for a moment, like she was deciding something, and then she smiled, and I understood that I was in some kind of trouble. We were married 18 months later, in October of 2006, at Wheeler Avenue Baptist Church, in front of 212 people. Her mother cried. My mother had been gone 6 years by then, so my Aunt Cecile cried on her behalf, which she had volunteered to do, and which she did thoroughly. The early years had a specific texture that I still carry clearly. Saturday mornings with the gospel station left low in the kitchen, while Carla made eggs and I sliced fruit. Neither of us saying much because we didn't need to. The way she'd sit in the front row at the Bronze Room on Friday nights, one leg crossed over the other, nodding at the precise moments when the music said something worth acknowledging. Not performing her enjoyment, but genuinely inside it. She had a good ear. She never told me that, and I never told her I noticed. The Bronze Room was a narrow jazz club on Hadley Street that held maybe 80 people on a crowded night, and smelled like old wood and whatever they were cooking in the kitchen next door. I played there twice a month with a quartet, Marcus Webb on bass, a rotating cast of drummers, and a pianist named Gerald Fontenot, who had been playing Houston clubs since 1987 and treated every Friday like it might be the last Good Friday. I was not performing for a living. I was performing because stopping would have meant losing access to a part of myself one wasn't willing to surrender. Carla understood that in the early years. She understood it the way you understand something you haven't yet been asked to pay for. Dana Okafor entered Carla's life in the spring of 2008, when the pharmaceutical company reorganized its Houston territory and assigned Carla a new lunch partner for the medical center calls. Dana was warm, funny, and completely without guile. She was not a calculating woman, and that is important to understand. She was not trying to make Carla feel anything in particular. She was simply a person for whom money had never been a source of anxiety, and that quality, in another person's proximity, can do its own quiet damage. Her husband, Preston, developed commercial real estate across the Houston metro. He had a project in the Energy Corridor, then one in Katy, then a mixed-use development off Westheimer that Dana mentioned had already pre-leased 60% of its retail space before breaking ground. Dana talked about these things the way you talk about the weather, as context, as backdrop, as the unremarkable condition of her days. She drove a white Range Rover that she mentioned was Preston's idea. They spent 2 weeks in Portugal in the summer, and she brought Carla back a small ceramic tile as a gift, hand-painted, which Carla set on the kitchen windowsill at home, and which I noticed but did not ask about. I want to be precise about what happened to Carla during those lunch conversations, because it was not simple jealousy. And Carla was not a jealous woman. What those conversations did was more structural than that. They gave her a unit of measurement she had not previously possessed, and once you have a unit of measurement, you begin to measure things. She began, without fully deciding to compare the architecture of her life against the architecture of Dana's life. And the comparison was not favorable, and she did not know what to do with that information, so she kept it to herself. There was also her father. Roosevelt Watford retired from the United States Postal Service in 2009, after 31 years, with a pension of $1,840 a month, and a dignity so intact it was almost painful to look at directly. He was a man who had done everything correctly by every standard he had been given, and what he had arrived at was enough, just barely enough, in the way that requires constant, careful management and leaves no room for the unexpected. In February of 2010, he had a procedure on his left knee that his supplemental insurance covered at 70%. The remaining 30% was $2,200. He mentioned it once at Sunday dinner, framed as information rather than a request, and Carla called me 2 days later. She was traveling for work, and asked if we had anything extra in savings. I said we could move some things around. She said never mind, she'd handle it. She did handle it. She handled the second bill too, 14 months later. A different procedure. Same knee, $1,800, her portion. She did not tell me about either one. Not because I wouldn't have helped. I would have, without hesitation. She didn't tell me because she had already begun, or at some level below conscious decision, to manage things separately. The housewarming was in November of 2011. Preston and Dana had purchased a property in River Oaks, 6,000 square feet on Inwood Drive, with a kitchen that had been photographed for a design magazine and a backyard that involved a level of landscaping I associated with institutions rather than private homes. Carla went without me. I had a Friday night gig I had committed to 3 weeks earlier, and she told me it was fine. Go play. She'd represent us both. She drove home alone at 11:15 that night and sat in the car in our driveway for a while before coming inside. I know this because I came home at 11:40 from the gig, and her car was warm when I touched the hood. She was already in bed, facing the wall, and she said she was tired when I came in, and I said okay, and I went to brush my teeth, and when I came back she was either asleep or doing a thorough job of resembling sleep. She didn't tell me about the party that night. She didn't tell me the week after. She never told me. 3 weeks later, she opened a savings account at a different bank from the one we shared. She told herself, and I believe she genuinely meant it, that it was just practical. A separate account for her own expenses. Something of her own in case. The account had nothing to do with me. That's what she told herself. And the distance between what we tell ourselves and what is actually happening. That distance is where marriages go to die slowly, in the dark, without either person fully realizing they've left the lights off. And the separate account became a habit. And habits, over enough time, become posture. And posture, over enough time, becomes the shape of a life. A marriage doesn't break the way glass breaks. There's no single moment, No clear line between before and after. No sound you can point to later and say, there. That was it. What happens is quieter and slower and considerably harder to defend against, because at each individual step the change is small enough to absorb without alarm. You absorb it, and then you absorb the next one. And somewhere in the accumulation of small absorptions, you look up and realize the room you're standing in doesn't look the way it used to, and you can't quite remember when the light changed. Year 6 of our marriage, I started driving to 3rd Ward on Saturday mornings. Not every Saturday, 2 or 3 times a month, and depending on what Clifton had surfaced that needed attention. A title question on the Elgin Street parcel. A survey dispute on a lot on Velasco that one of Solomon's cousins had signed over to a neighbor in 1984 for reasons that were not entirely clear and required careful untangling. The work was granular and slow and deeply unglamorous, and it required my physical presence in a way that was difficult to explain without explaining everything, which I was not yet prepared to do. I told Carla I was going to 3rd Ward to handle some family property matters. That was true. It was also the entirety of what I told her, and the gap between that truth and the full truth was wide enough to drive 10 Suburbans through, which is eventually what happened. In the beginning, she didn't ask much. By year 7, she had stopped asking entirely. And I had mistaken her silence for acceptance, when it was actually a different thing. A woman who has decided that asking questions she won't get full answers to is a form of diminishment she is no longer willing to practice. Year 7 was also when she stopped coming to the Friday night gigs. The first few times she had other plans, or was tired from a long week on the road. And those were legitimate reasons, and I accepted them as such. Then the pattern established itself and we didn't discuss it, because to discuss it would have required one of us to say something that would then need to be responded to, and we had both become, by year 7, cautious about starting conversations whose direction we couldn't predict. So I played the Bronze Room on Friday nights, and she stayed home. And on Saturday mornings I drove to 3rd Ward. And the weekend hours that had once belonged to us together quietly became hours we spent in parallel. Clifton Barnes had an office on the 14th floor of a building on Greenway Plaza that smelled like recycled air and expensive coffee. I had been meeting with him monthly since 2007, when I had finally walked into his office with Solomon's shoebox and sat down across from him and said I need to understand what I have. He had gone through the documents with the methodical patience of a man who has seen complicated things and knows that complication responds to patience better than urgency. At the end of that first meeting, he set his pen down and looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "This is going to take a while to untangle." I said, "I know." He said, "Are you in a hurry?" I said, "No." He nodded once, as if I had passed a test he hadn't announced he was giving. Our monthly meetings became the most honest conversations in my life. Not because I am dishonest elsewhere, I am not, but because Clifton was the only person who possessed the complete picture, which meant he was the only person I didn't have to manage information around. I could say exactly where things stood, and what I was concerned about, and what I didn't know, and he would respond with the same precision, and we would make a plan, and execute it, and meet again the following month to assess. He knew about the land. He knew about the family complications. He knew about Carla, though I kept those disclosures professional and brief. What he knew about Carla, specifically, is that she didn't know about the trust. He raised it once, in 2013, and in the careful way of a man who wants to say something without overstepping the boundaries of his role. He said, "At some point, Theo, this becomes relevant to her as well." I said, "I know." He paused in the way he pauses when he has more to say, but is deciding whether it's his to say. Then he moved on to the Velasco parcel, and we didn't return to it. I should have returned to it. In February of 2014, which was year 9 of the marriage, I tried. We were eating dinner on a Thursday night. Carla had made pot roast, which she only made when she had time, and having time was becoming less common as her territory expanded. And I put my fork down and said, "I want to tell you something about the land in 3rd Ward." She looked up. Her expression was attentive but slightly guarded, the way it gets when she's been surprised by a topic change. I told her that Solomon had accumulated parcels over several decades, that the family had lost 2 of them, that I had been working with an attorney to sort out what remained, that there might be something meaningful there eventually when the work was done. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So it's like a family history thing." I said not exactly. I said it was property. Real property, with real value, potentially. She nodded slowly. She said, "Your grandfather always did love that neighborhood." And then she asked if I wanted more roast, and I said yes, and she got up to get it. And the conversation was over. I sat there for a moment after she left the table, and I understood, with a clarity that arrived too late to be useful, what had happened. And she had heard me say 3rd Ward and old property and family, and she had organized it into a category she already possessed. Sentimental attachment to a place and a man who were gone. She had heard the melody and missed the ledger entirely, and it was my fault because I had played the melody too softly and left the ledger in another room. I didn't try again. That is the thing I am least proud of in this entire story. I didn't try again. By year 10, the guitar case had migrated from the bedroom closet to the garage. Neither of us moved it deliberately. It simply traveled, the way objects do in a home when their symbolic weight becomes something people work around rather than address. I noticed it on a Saturday morning in October, sitting between a box of old textbooks and a folding table we used for cookouts. I looked at it for a moment, and then I got in my car and drove to 3rd Ward. Year 12, Carla made an appointment with a woman named Andrea Simmons, a family law attorney whose office was in Greenway Plaza, 2 floors below Clifton Barnes, a coincidence I didn't learn about until much later. She went once. She did not file anything. She told Yolanda she was just gathering information, which is what people say when they are standing at the edge of something and not quite ready to step off. I found out about the appointment 8 months later, not from Carla, but from a comment Yolanda made at a family gathering that she immediately regretted, and walked back with a smoothness that told me she had practice walking back such things. I drove home from that gathering and made a drink, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the backyard, and my hand on the glass was steady, which surprised me. That night, from the guest room where she'd gone to take a call from her mother that ran long, I heard Carla's voice drop into the register it drops into when she is saying something she has been holding for a while. I could not make out the words through the wall. I didn't need to. When she came out 20 minutes later, her face was composed, and she said good night, and I said good night, and we went to sleep in the same bed, in the same house that was by then, in all the ways that matter, 2 separate residences sharing a roof. The next morning, she made coffee for both of us without being asked, which she had always done, which she kept doing until nearly the end. And that small continued gesture is the thing I find hardest to think about, even now. The call came on a Wednesday in June, 14 months before the closing. I was in my classroom at Worthing High School during 4th period conference, which meant the room was empty and the door was half open, and the hallway outside carried the particular low roar of 500 teenagers existing at maximum volume between classes. One was grading chord progression worksheets when the phone on my desk rang. The school's landline, which almost nobody used anymore, which is precisely why I answered it. The voice on the other end was young and unhurried, with the specific confidence of someone who has been told they're good at this. He said his name was Brandon Achebe, and that he was a reporter with the Houston Business Journal, and that he was working on a piece about development activity in the Third Ward corridor, and had come across some references to a Grimes Family Land Trust in City Planning Commission documents, and was wondering if I had any comment. I want to tell you what happened in my body when he said that. Nothing dramatic, no spike of panic, no sudden heat in the face. What happened was a specific interior stillness, the kind that arrives when a situation requires your complete attention, and your body understands this before your mind has finished processing the information. My hand on the desk went flat. My breathing slowed by about half. I said, "I'm not sure I know what you're referring to." He said he understood, and that he was happy to share what he had found, if that would be helpful for context. I said that was kind of him, but that I had a class in about 12 minutes, and wasn't the right person to speak to about family property matters in any case. He said he appreciated my time. He left his number. I wrote it on the back of a chord progression worksheet that I folded once and put in my jacket pocket, and later burned in the small metal drum my uncle kept in his backyard for exactly that category of paper. I called Clifton before the next class started. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been expecting something like this, or something adjacent to it. I gave him the reporter's name and publication. He was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted. Not because the stillness in his silence had a texture I had learned to read across 8 years of working together. Then he said, "How much did you tell him?" I said nothing of substance. He said, "Good." Then he said, "We need to talk this afternoon." I was at his office on Greenway Plaza by 4:15. He had already pulled the City Planning Commission filings and identified the document that contained the reference, a routine easement application on a parcel adjacent to one of ours that had been filed by the Development Consortium's attorneys and had not been adequately scrubbed of identifying trust language, a clerical error. The kind that happens when transactions of this size involve too many moving pieces and not enough people checking each other's work. Clifton sat back in his chair and laced his hands together and looked at me in the way he looks at me when he is about to say something I need to hear without decoration. He said, "We have a window, 18 months, maybe less, before this becomes the kind of thing that attracts the kind of attention that complicates a closing. Reporters talk to each other. Planning Commission documents become public record requests. I need you to understand that the timeline has moved." I said I understood. He said, "Theo, I need you to actually understand it." I looked at him. I said, 18 months. He nodded once. We spent the next 40 minutes working through what needed to be accelerated, and what could be compressed without compromising the title work, and what could not, under any circumstances, be rushed. When I left his office, it was past 6, and the building's lobby was nearly empty, and I stood at the elevator for a moment with the particular sensation of a man who has just been told that the thing he has been building for 9 years needs to be completed in a significantly shorter time than he had planned. I drove home. Carla was in the kitchen when I came in, still in her work clothes, a glass of water on the counter beside her while she went through the mail. I set my bag down and loosened my collar, and she said, "Dinner would be about 30 minutes. She was doing the salmon." I said, "That sounded good." It was a normal evening. That's the thing I keep returning to. It was entirely normal, which meant we had become so accustomed to moving carefully around each other that a day containing a reporter's call and an emergency meeting with my attorney registered in our shared domestic space as nothing, as weather as Tuesday. I was in the shower when she found the call log. Our home phone, a landline we kept primarily for her mother, who didn't trust cell reception, had a small digital display that showed recent incoming and outgoing calls. I had called Clifton from that phone before leaving for his office, and his name and number were sitting in the call history when Carla walked past the phone table in the hallway, which she did every evening on her way to change clothes. She didn't mention it while I was in the shower. She didn't mention it at dinner. She waited until we were cleaning up and the salmon was put away, and the kitchen was quiet. And then she said, with a casualness that I recognized immediately as constructed, "Who's Clifton Barnes?" I turned from the sink. She was drying her hands on a dish towel, not looking at me directly. I said, "An attorney. Family property matter." She nodded, still looking at the dish towel. She said, "Real estate attorney?" I said he handled a few different things, which was true. I said it was related to the Third Ward situation, which was also true. She folded the towel and set it on the counter and said, "Okay," and went to finish changing clothes, and I stood at the kitchen sink, with the water still running for a moment longer than I needed to. She Googled him that night. I know this because our internet provider's app shows device activity on the home network, which I had occasion to check the following morning for an unrelated reason. And her phone had queried Clifton Barnes, attorney, Houston, at 11:47 p.m., which was 40 minutes after I had heard her turn off her bedside lamp. The Barnes & Collier firm website listed his practice areas in the following order: commercial real estate, property trust administration, title litigation, estate law. It was right there on the homepage, clear as a street sign. She didn't ask me anything further. Not that night, not the following week. What she did, 2 weeks later, was call Andrea Simmons at the family law office on Greenway Plaza and tell her she was ready to move forward with the paperwork. I didn't know that yet. I found out later, through a sequence of events I will get to. What I knew that night was that the call log had been seen, and the website had been visited, and the question had been asked, and the answer I gave had been received, and whatever Carla made of those pieces was now living somewhere inside her that I didn't have access to. I drove to Third Ward that night after she fell asleep. I didn't plan to. I just found myself on I-59 heading east, and then on Blodgett, and then I parked on Holman Street across from the lot that Solomon had purchased in 1958 for $800. The oak tree was still there, impossible and permanent, and around it on all four sides the neighborhood had transformed into scaffolding and cranes and construction fencing bearing the logos of development companies whose names I had been reading in contracts for the better part of a year. And I sat in the truck in the dark with the engine off and the windows down and the night air coming in carrying heat and concrete dust, and somewhere, a few blocks over, someone's music. The deadline was real now. The question of the marriage was real now. And the space between the two, the space where I had been living, quietly, for years, telling myself I was waiting for the right moment, that space had just gotten considerably smaller. Something needed to be decided. Not about the closing. The closing was going to happen regardless. What needed to be decided was what I was doing it for, and who I was going to be when it was over. That decision is where the next part of this story lives. I sat in that truck for a long time before I did anything at all. The street was quiet, the way Third Ward gets quiet late at night. Not silent, but settled, the daytime noise replaced by something more personal. A television through an open window, the cooling tick of my engine. Somewhere down the block, wind moving through a stand of crepe myrtles that had been there since before I was born, and would be there after the construction cranes were gone. The lot across the street was ringed by chain-link construction fencing, and beyond the fencing I could see the concrete pilings of a foundation going in. part of the mixed-use development that the consortium had already begun on the parcels they'd acquired from other sellers, while waiting for the Grimes Trust to make its decision. The oak tree was still inside the fence line, still standing, here because I had made its preservation a non-negotiable term in the preliminary agreement, and Clifton had put it in writing, and the consortium's attorneys had accepted it without much argument. Some things you don't negotiate. You just state them clearly, and wait to see if the other party is serious. I had been stating things clearly my whole life, just not always to the right people. I turned the engine off and sat with the windows down, and I let myself think about something I had been carefully not thinking about for the better part of 3 years. I let myself think about why I had never told Carla. The reason I had given myself, the reason I had given Clifton, when he raised it that one time, in his careful way, was that the work wasn't finished, that you don't discuss unfinished business, that Solomon had not discussed it, and that a man does not count money that isn't in his hand yet. These were true things, or they contained truth, the way a sentence can be accurate and still be incomplete. But sitting on Holman Street at close to midnight, with the timeline compressed, and the marriage somewhere past the point of comfortable rescue, I ran out of room to maintain the incomplete version. The full version was this. I was afraid, not of losing the land, not of the deal collapsing. I was afraid of telling Carla the complete truth about the trust. All of it, the parcels, the amounts, the 9 years of Saturday mornings, the shoebox, Solomon's instruction, the full architecture of what I had been carrying, and then watching her leave anyway. Because if she knew everything and still decided I wasn't enough, there would be no version of that I could absorb and remain intact. Silence had kept that particular outcome theoretical. Theoretical I could live with. Confirmed I was not sure about. I sat with that for a while. The way you sit with something when you finally stop pretending it's smaller than it is. Here is what I decided. Alone in that truck, in the dark, with the construction fencing across the street, and Solomon's oak tree standing in the middle of it. The fear was real. And it was also not a good enough reason. It had never been a good enough reason. I had dressed it up as discipline and called it patience, and let it wear Solomon's philosophy like a coat that didn't quite fit. And I had been doing that for 9 years, and the cost of it was sitting in a house in Sugarland, looking up Clifton Barnes's website at 11:47 at night, trying to figure out what her own husband was doing. I had not lied to Carla. I had let her build a false picture from true materials, and I had told myself that the difference between those two things was meaningful. Sitting on Holman Street, I stopped believing that. But here is the other thing I decided. And this part is harder to explain in a way that doesn't sound like rationalization. So I'll ask you to stay with me. The marriage was over. Not because I had decided it was, and not because Carla was wrong to feel what she felt. It was over because two people had spent years moving carefully around each other in a shared space. And that kind of careful movement, practiced long enough, becomes the relationship. There was nothing left to save that would have been worth the saving. Not the way you save something, as a transaction, as a negotiation. What we had built in that house was already finished. Telling her now, with the closing 14 months away, and the divorce papers presumably in process somewhere, would look like exactly what it was. A man deploying information to change an outcome. Even if my intentions were clean, the timing was not. See, and I had enough of Solomon in me to understand that a thing done for the right reason at the wrong moment is still the wrong thing. So the decision was not to tell her, and it was not to stay silent to protect myself. Those things look similar from the outside, and they are completely different from the inside, and the inside is where you have to live. The decision was to finish the work, to complete it correctly, for the right reasons, because Solomon had asked me to, and because it was the right thing to do, and because 2 families' worth of patience and strategy deserved an ending that honored them. Not as a statement, not as a demonstration of anything to anyone, just as a completed thing, handed over whole. I reached into the back seat for the guitar case. I laid it across my lap and opened it, on moving the documents aside until I found the one I was looking for, the original deed for the Holman Street parcel, Harris County, 1958, with Solomon's name absent from the title and Beatrice Grimes of Galveston, Texas, listed as owner of record. I held it in the dome light of the truck and read it the way you read something you have read many times before, but need to read once more to remind yourself what it actually says. It said, "Someone did this work before you, in harder conditions, with less. Someone made a choice to build something they might not live to see completed, for people who would come after. And they did it without announcement or acknowledgement or anyone to tell them they were doing the right thing." I folded the deed carefully along its original creases and placed it back in the case and latched it closed. Just then I started the truck and drove home. The house was dark when I got there. I came in through the side door and moved through the kitchen without turning on any lights, and went down the hall to the bedroom. Carla was asleep, facing the window, one arm along the edge of the mattress in the way she sleeps when she has the bed to herself. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I went to the guest room, because it seemed like the right thing, and I lay down in the dark and looked at the ceiling. And I did not sleep for a long time, but I was not troubled by that. The next 14 months happened the way the last 14 months of anything happen, faster than expected, and with less ceremony than the weight of them deserved. Clifton accelerated the title work. The consortium's attorneys finalized the purchase agreement, though Carla's paperwork moved through channels I was not privy to. We shared the house in the careful way we had mastered, and we were not unkind to each other, and sometimes in the morning she still made coffee for 2 without being asked, and I drank it and said thank you, and meant it. The closing was scheduled for a Tuesday in August. The Tuesday happened to be the same morning Carla had arranged for her mother to come for dinner, which I found out from a calendar notification on the shared phone account that I was technically still a part of. She asked me to be gone before her mother arrived. I said, okay. I packed 2 suitcases and a guitar case, and I carried them to the driveway, and the door closed behind me, and the August heat came up off the concrete. And I stood there in the middle of the life I had built, and the life that was ending, and the life that was about to begin. And then 10 black Suburbans turned onto our street, and everything that had been private became, in its own quiet way, complete. The Suburban was cold inside, the air conditioning set to the temperature of a place that takes itself seriously. I settled into the back seat with the guitar case across my knees, and for a moment nobody said anything, which was its own kind of courtesy. Clifton was to my left, his reading glasses on, a manila folder open across his lap. He had the particular stillness of a man in his element, unhurried, calibrated, already 3 steps ahead, and content to let events proceed at their own pace toward the conclusion he had already mapped. Jerome Watts, my financial manager, I sat in the front passenger seat with a leather portfolio that I happened to know contained, among other things, wire transfer instructions for an account I had opened at Prosperity Bank in 2019, specifically for this day. Jerome was 53 years old and had been managing money for 26 years and almost never spoke in meetings unless asked a direct question, which was one of the reasons I trusted him. Adrian was behind me in the 3rd row, quiet in the way of someone who has been carrying this alongside you and understands that arrival is not the same as completion. She had driven up from Galveston the night before and stayed at a hotel on Main Street, and when she had texted me at 6:15 in the morning to confirm she was ready, I had looked at the message for a long time before I responded. She was the last living connection to Beatrice, Solomon's sister, whose name was on that first deed, and her being present today was not procedural. It was something else. Deshawn was directly beside me. He had not said a word since I got into the vehicle, which, if you know Deshawn, tells you everything about the gravity he had assigned to the morning. We were on I-59, heading east toward downtown when he finally spoke. He said, "You good, T?" I looked out the window at the city moving past, the highway overpass, the downtown skyline beginning to assemble itself against the August sky. The particular quality of Houston light at that hour, flat and total and indifferent to whatever you were carrying through it. I said, "I think so." He nodded. He said, "She didn't see them. The trucks." I said, "No." He said, "Okay." And that was the entire conversation. It was enough. The offices of Hargrove, Dunlap, and Associates occupied the 38th floor of a building on Lamar Street with a lobby that smelled like marble and recycled air, and the faint antiseptic quality of very expensive decisions being made above you at all times. We rode the elevator in silence, Clifton reviewing documents, Jerome making a quiet call to confirm the wire routing, Adrienne standing with her hands folded in front of her, looking at the elevator doors with an expression I recognized from church. The face of someone engaged in a private conversation that didn't require words. The conference room was large and deliberately neutral, the way rooms are when they've been designed to contain disagreement without inflaming it. The floor-to-ceiling windows on the south wall looked out over downtown Houston, and beyond it, if you knew where to look, the rooftops of Third Ward. I looked. I found the approximate location of Holman Street and held it for a moment before I sat down. The consortium's attorneys were already seated, 3 of them from a firm called Meridian Land Partners based in Dallas. They were professional and efficient and gave every indication of being well compensated for being both. Across from them, Clifton settled his folder on the table and removed his reading glasses from his breast pocket and put them on with the manner of a man arriving at something that has been a long time coming. Documents moved across the table in sequence. The trust transfer instruments first, and then the title conveyances for each parcel, all 11 of the remaining ones, laid out in the order of their original acquisition, which was Clifton's idea and which I appreciated without saying so. Each one required signatures from the trust's authorized parties. Adrienne signed where indicated, with the steady hand of someone who has been preparing for this and knows it. I signed beside her each time, working through 11 parcels, 11 pieces of ground, 11 decisions Solomon had made in the years between 1958 and 1978, when he was building something the world could not yet see. Clifton signed as trust counsel. Jerome initialed the financial exhibits. The consortium's attorneys countersigned in sequence. The whole process took 47 minutes, conducted in near silence except for the turning of pages and the occasional quiet direction from the closing coordinator, a woman named Patricia Osei, who ran the proceedings with the practiced calm of someone who has overseen transactions of this size before and understands that gravity is best honored through precision. When the final transfer document reached me, the Holman Street parcel, the first one, the oak tree, I set my pen down before signing it. I reached into the guitar case at my feet and removed the 1951 deed. I placed it on the table beside the transfer document, not for anyone else's benefit, but because it seemed right to have them in the same place, the beginning and the end, Solomon's handwritten name absent from both and present in everything. Then I signed. and it was done. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment. I have turned it over many times, looking for the word, and the closest I can get is this. I felt the specific lightness of a thing that has been carried for a long time being set down correctly. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something quieter than both. Clifton shook my hand. Jerome shook my hand. Adrienne held mine for a moment longer than a handshake and said quietly, "Granddaddy would be satisfied." And I nodded because I didn't trust my voice completely right then, and I knew enough to protect it. What I did not know, at that moment, was what was happening 23 miles southwest, in the kitchen of a townhouse in Sugar Land. Carla's realtor was a woman named Michelle Fontenot, no relation to the pianist, who had been engaged 2 weeks prior to begin the quiet process of listing the property. Michelle was thorough and professional, and she had a Google alert set for Houston real estate news, as most active realtors do. The Houston Business Journal's digital edition had published the story at 10:47 that morning. Grimes Family Land Trust closes $61 million Third Ward deal. The piece ran with a photograph from the consortium's press release. Theo Grimes, the caption read. Trustee. The article described the transaction in specific terms: the acreage, the purchase price, the development consortium, the decades-long family accumulation that preceded it. Michelle saw the alert at 11:03. She recognized the last name from the listing paperwork on her desk. She called Carla at 11:09. Carla was at the kitchen island with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Yolanda was there, sitting across from her, scrolling through her phone. When Carla's phone rang and she saw Michelle's name, she answered with the expectant tone of someone waiting on practical news about a practical matter. But what she got instead was Michelle's voice doing a thing that voices do when the speaker is attempting professionalism over the top of something they were not expecting. Slightly elevated, slightly careful. Michelle said she wasn't sure if Carla had seen something in the news this morning. She said she wanted to make sure Carla was aware of a story in the Business Journal. She said it involved a property transaction. She said Carla's husband's name was in it. Carla put the call on speaker and found the article. She read the headline twice. Then she read the first paragraph. Then she set the phone down on the island and looked at it the way you look at something when your eyes are working, but the rest of your processing has temporarily gone elsewhere. Yolanda said, "What is it?" Carla didn't answer. She picked the phone back up and read further. She read the description of the trust. She read the acreage. She read the purchase price. $61 million? And she read it again. She Googled Clifton Barnes, and the Barnes & Collier firm page came up immediately, and she looked at the practice areas she had read on that same page at 11:47 on a June night 14 months ago, and this time the words Real Estate and Trust Administration carried a different weight than they had before. The Third Ward trips, every Saturday morning, years of them, the guitar case in the garage, and the way he would sometimes check the latch before he left, a small automatic gesture she had attributed to habit. An old family matter. The article had a photograph of him, a recent one, professional, taken at some point she couldn't place. Not at school, not at a gig. In it, he was wearing a jacket she didn't recognize, looking at something slightly off camera, and his expression was the expression she knew best on him. Patient, certain, already somewhere ahead of the present moment. She had seen that expression 10,000 times and had spent years reading it as distance. She set the phone face down on the island. She did not pick it up again for a long time. Yolanda was very still across from her. Neither of them spoke. The coffee on the island was cold, and the kitchen was quiet, and outside through the window, the August heat pressed against the glass with its total, indifferent weight. Carla did not call me. I did not call her. At 12:34, I walked out of the elevator into the Lamar Street lobby, guitar case in hand, and through the revolving door onto the sidewalk. The heat came down like a physical thing after 47 minutes in the controlled air of that conference room. I stood on the sidewalk and I breathed it in. The heat, the exhaust, the city, all of it. The Suburbans were at the curb. Clifton's driver had the rear door open. Deshaun was already inside, looking at his phone. I looked at the open door for a moment, then I stepped back and raised my hand for a cab. The driver who stopped was a man named Ernest, according to the card on the dash. I got in with the guitar case, and he asked me where to, and I said, 3rd Ward, Holman Street. He pulled into traffic, and I looked out the window at the city moving past, and I thought about an oak tree inside a construction fence. He and a man who bought the ground it stood on for $800 in 1958, and the specific instruction he had left behind on an index card that I had read so many times I no longer needed to look at it to know exactly what it said. Finish what I started. Don't talk about it. Just finish it. I had finished it. The talking could begin now or not. That part, finally, was mine to choose. The weeks after the closing did not look the way people might expect. There was no confrontation, no dramatic scene in a driveway with raised voices and things finally said. That is not how Carla operates, and it is not how I operate. And by the time the closing happened, we had both had enough practice at managing difficult things quietly that even this, the most difficult thing, got managed quietly. I want to note that deliberately, because I think people expect a moment of reckoning to have the shape of a storm. Sometimes it has the shape of paperwork moving between attorneys' offices on a Tuesday afternoon, and two people in separate locations deciding, independently, that some things no longer require a fight. I was living at the Marriott on Main Street in Midtown, room 714, which had a window that faced west and caught the late afternoon light in a way that reminded me, more than once, of the light in my grandmother's kitchen on Tuam Street, low and amber and specific to a particular hour. I had one suitcase. Someone retrieved the other one from the Sugarland driveway later that week, along with a few boxes of books and the Harmony Sovereign from the garage, the guitar case I had kept with me from the moment I walked to that lead Suburban, and it had not left my possession. The settlement negotiations were handled by attorneys who were professional and thorough, and who communicated through channels that kept Carla and me at a careful distance from each other, which was the right arrangement for that particular season. I will not detail the terms here. What I will say is that I was fair, and that fairness was not difficult, because I had not spent 9 years preserving Solomon's legacy in order to argue about it afterward. Carla requested one conversation, not through the attorneys, through a text message, brief and carefully worded, that arrived on a Thursday evening 3 weeks after the closing. She said she wanted to understand. She said she was not asking for anything, only to understand. We met for coffee at a place on Westheimer, neutral ground, on a Saturday morning. Here I will not reconstruct that conversation here, because some things belong only to the people who were in the room. What I will tell you is that I said what needed to be said, and I said it without anger and without the satisfaction of being right, because being right had cost something I had genuinely loved. And there is nothing satisfying about that particular arithmetic. She listened. At the end, she sat with her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the table for a while. And then she looked at me and said, "I didn't know you were that person." I said, "I know." She nodded once, and we finished our coffee, and we left. and that was the last time we sat across a table from each other. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. I drove to Forest Park Cemetery on a Wednesday morning in September, early, before the heat had fully committed to the day. My father's headstone is a simple gray granite marker. Emmett Lewis Grimes, 1946 to 2008. Faithful and steady. And I stood in front of it for a while without any particular agenda. I had visited since his death, many times, but this visit had a different quality. It had the quality of a report delivered. I told him what had been completed. I told him about the parcels, all 11 of them, and the trust, and the closing, and the oak tree on Holman Street that was still standing. I told him I understood now why Solomon had passed the burden to me directly, not because my father wasn't capable, but because the weight of it would have been different for him, given what he'd lost, and Solomon had understood that. Fathers sometimes know which wounds they've passed down. Solomon's grave is 8 rows over, beneath a live oak that is not as old or as improbable as the one on Holman Street, but has the same quality of having decided, without consultation, to remain. I put my hand on the marker. Solomon James Grimes, 1921 to 1994. He did his part. And one stood there until I felt ready to leave. And then I left. The first public act one made with the Trust's resources was not a building or a monument or anything that would have my name on it. In early October, I contacted the Houston Area Urban League and funded 12 seats in their fall land and property ownership workshop, a 6-week program designed for young adults who had no prior framework for thinking about real estate as a tool rather than a destination. I enrolled 2 of my former students from Worthing specifically, a young man named Darius Phelps, who was 22 and sharp, and had grown up 3 blocks from the Holman Street parcel, and a young woman named Camille Okafor, no relation to Dana, who had played first-chair clarinet in my band for 3 years, and had the particular quality of attention that Solomon would have recognized immediately as the thing that matters most. I did not tell them where the funding came from. That felt right. I want to speak to you directly now, if I may. Not as a narrator, just as a person who has been inside this story and has had time to understand what it was actually about. The first thing I learned is that silence is not one thing. There is silence that protects, that holds something fragile until it is strong enough to survive exposure. And there is silence that withholds, that keeps the people closest to you from knowing who they are actually standing next to. Solomon's silence was the first kind. Mine began as the first kind and became the second. And I did not notice the moment it crossed over because I was too committed to the story I was telling myself about why I was doing it. If there is a lesson in that, it is this. The reasons we protect our silence deserve more scrutiny than the silence itself. The silence is just the symptom. The fear underneath it is the thing worth examining. The second thing I learned is that inherited wisdom and inherited wounds often come in the same package and are often indistinguishable from each other until you are well into carrying them. Solomon taught me patience and strategy and the value of completion over announcement. He also taught me, without meaning to, that a man should not need to be understood, should not require explanation. She should let the work speak, and trust that people will eventually hear it. That was his wound speaking, shaped by decades of having to hide what he built because the world required it. I inherited the philosophy without the context, and I applied it to a marriage in 2006 as if nothing had changed since 1958. And something had changed considerably, and I should have known the difference. The third thing is the hardest. Love is not self-evident. That is a thing I believed, in the romantic way of a man who communicates in music, that love expressed fully and consistently, translates itself. That the other person simply receives it and understands what it means. It doesn't work that way. Love requires translation. It requires the specific. I sometimes uncomfortable labor of putting your interior life into language that the person across from you can actually use. Carla deserved that translation. I was capable of it. I chose for reasons that felt like discipline and were partly fear, not to provide it. That is my part of this story, and I own it without reservation. Now, I want to come back to those 10 black Suburbans for a moment. I have thought about what that image must have looked like from the outside. 10 vehicles turning onto a quiet cul-de-sac in Sugarland on a Tuesday morning, moving in formation, arriving for a man standing in a driveway with a guitar case. I understand why it reads, from a certain angle, like vindication, like the universe correcting something, and I won't pretend there wasn't something in me in that moment, and that felt the rightness of it, not as triumph, but as completion, as a thing arriving on schedule after a long journey at the place it was always going. But those trucks were not there for Carla. They were not there to make a point, or settle a score, or demonstrate anything to anyone. They were there because Solomon Grimes bought a lot on Holman Street in 1958 for $800 and told no one, and his grandson spent 9 years honoring that decision, and the work was finished, and Clifton Barnes does not miss a closing. That is all it was. It just happened to occur on the morning of the last day of my marriage, which is the kind of timing that life occasionally produces, indifferent to narrative convenience. I own the house on Holman Street now. It is a small craftsman bungalow, built in 1941, 2 bedrooms, or a porch that runs the width of the front, that I had constructed on the lot as part of a separate agreement with the consortium, who retained development rights to the surrounding parcels, but allowed me to carve out the original footprint where the oak tree stands. The house sits at the back of the lot. The tree is in the yard. The construction that surrounds the property on 3 sides is loud during the week and quiet on weekends, and I have made my peace with the noise, because noise, in 3rd Ward, has always meant that something is being built. On Sunday mornings I sit on that porch with the Harmony Sovereign that Solomon left me, and I play. Not for anyone, not for a crowd or a club or a grade, just for the practice of it, and because music was the thing that carried me toward Carla, and it seems right to let it also carry me forward. I into whatever comes next, without putting that weight down. The guitar case sits beside my chair when I play. The deed is still inside it. I have thought about framing it, or donating it to the Houston Metropolitan Research Center's archive, and I may eventually do one of those things. But for now, I like it where it is. In the case, with the guitar, in the same space where it has lived since I was 19 years old, and made a promise to a man who had already left the room. Solomon did his part. That's what the stone says. I did mine. It took a while. It cost something real. And it is finished, which is the only thing he ever asked of me. There is a particular peace that comes not from winning, but from completing. From arriving at the end of a long, serious piece of work, and knowing it was done correctly. It does not announce itself. It does not require an audience. It settles into you quietly, the way the right chord resolves, and you recognize it not because it is loud, but because something that was tense for a very long time, finally, simply, is not. That is where I live now. It is enough.